Welcome to episode 5 of the Swishoes podcast on followership. And today we have Thierry Fausten, Armin Scharlach and Bob Dignen with myself, Bill Young, to look at the subject of followership. Let's go round the table and ask each of you what you understand by followership. May I start with you, Thierry?
So what I understand with followership, you have two different dimensions. The first one, obviously, is the crowd that follows you, what you strive for on LinkedIn or when you make a speech or you try to get people to like what you say and, keep up to date on your communication statements. In a company, it's still about who is following you, but it's also who you are able to attract. And I think this is a key component here, is who are you able to convince that what you're saying is of value beyond only having a hierarchical link of people that will obey your orders, which then is not followership. It's a very different attitude there.
To build on what Thierry has been just saying, I think the key element of followership and good leadership in return is the voluntary elements. So when people are voluntarily doing something that you want them to do, ideally, but not necessarily always also proactively, it doesn't have to necessarily be proactively, but at least voluntarily doing things that you want them to do. That is what true followership is, in my opinion.
It will be interesting to see what people thought followership was before switching onto this podcast. And Bob, what's your view?
What it is, let's start with what the word actually kind of, how that word impacts me. On the one hand, I find it a very uninspiring word, this concept of followership. It doesn't carry the same inspirational message that leadership has. That's interesting. I think that it's rather uninspiring and indicates at some level some degree of passivity and undertones of authoritarianism, if I can use that. That's what it sparks in me. You're following blind and passive into this heroic leader. On the other hand, I quite like it in that it takes the debate away from the heroic leader. In other words, that not everything happens because of single individuals. It happens because of systems and the many acting in a situation, which then brings me to the ultimate paradox of the term followership, because followership is, in a sense, modern leadership. That if we look at the evolution of the term leadership towards a collective phenomenon, followership is a bit of a misnomer. If you're following, you're leading. If you're leading, you're following. So the term carries both a lack of inspiration, a hope to move away from heroic leadership, but also a deep confusion, which doesn't really get us beyond the confusion that is in the word leadership as well. So I'm a little bit none the wiser as I examine the word, Bill. Sorry about that. So
I have some remarks on that, but before I go into that, Bill, what's your own point on that?
Okay, I'll give you mine. I was hoping you were going to come in and with some objections to Bob.
I will in a moment.
I have a completely different view of followership. To me, it is very active. It is the opposite of passive sheep-like followership. It is challenging your boss, challenging the leader to make sure that what they're proposing can actually be done. It is being the expert in your area so that the leader consults you before asking you to do anything. And it is related to the techniques used by the Prussian army in the 19th century, developed by von Moltke, and I looked at this some years back, in which he refused to take on officers or to recruit people to become officers unless they had disobeyed orders in the past. Because he was looking for people who, when they went into the field, in the heat of battle, when communication stopped, as they always do, and the situation develops to a stage that hadn't been foreseen, they would know what to do because you had shared the high-level strategy with them, so they weren't lost. They were part of the strategy and they were active and leading their men according to a strategy from several levels above them. And it was picked up by General Kelly in the States, who of course claimed ownership of the concept and thought it was invented by the US Army, but it does date back to von Moltke in the 19th century. And the Germans were still using it in the Second World War, which is why the Wehrmacht was so impressive. And I hate to say this with Thierry here, but it does explain why the Germans reached Paris so quickly in 1871. Was it the Franco-Prussian War? 70, yeah.
Well, they did it again in 1940.
They did it again in 1940. Same tactic.
I like history, and I think it has a lot to teach us.
So that's what I think of followership. It is a very active thing. So, Armin.
Now, with the active thing, as I mentioned earlier in my comment, I think that is a very helpful additional element, but it's not necessarily always a crucial element. Followership can exist without proactivism, but obviously it's a better followership if it is also proactive behavior inspiring. But coming back to both what you said, Bill, and what you said, Bob, I think there are different flavors of followership and leadership. There are good followership and bad followership. There are good leadership and bad leadership. Leadership can be in a good way that it encourages people to voluntarily follow the purpose and the goals that the leader is given, and is inspiring to them to be proactive, as Bill just laid out. But leadership as a term as such also could be a leadership style where you simply with brute force enforcing people to do what you want them to do. And the same is with followership. When Bob, you said you don't want to have people blindly following a leader. That is bad followership. It's still followership, but it is obviously not a good one for sure.
Yeah, I think, building on it, there is something that, you are referring to military examples. I know people that were in the very special forces in France, group of 20 that go in and take hostages out of Afghanistan and people like that. So very tiny world. And essentially their way of action is a very democratic followership in the sense that they know what the mission is. They agree on a plan. And as we all know, all plans go to pieces, to remain polite when confronted to the reality. And then everyone knows exactly what they can expect from others. And this is the way they, most of the times, come back alive with the mission accomplished. And I think that we were all referring to the self-management dimension of followership. You actively choose to follow, and you actively choose to engage with a certain crowd of people who are going to, willingly go and pursue a goal that they also believe in. Because I don't think that there is any way that people are going to commit to something when they don't believe in it. And that's why, if I refer to change management, the first thing is create a vision and a purpose. Why are we going to do this? And then somehow explain the objectives, the what, and you leave the how in the middle, up to the people. How are they going to execute that? Because they need autonomy to be creative and to have this personal commitment into that.
I think purpose is really the key. What Thierry was saying is absolutely right, that people need to share the purpose and understand and share the vision of why they should do certain things. Coming back to this military example, I think in the military there are situations where it is good, like you mentioned earlier, Bill, when people disobey and when they speak up and they do not simply follow what they are told. On the other hand, there are situations where it is absolutely essential that they do. But in order for them to actually do that and not being just blind followers, like Bob mentioned earlier, I think it needs a lot of trust into the leader, that this person is knowing what he or she is doing, is sharing the same idea and having the knowledge and the skills to decide what is necessary to be done, and therefore gives instructions that you better should follow.
Yeah, I keep writing down words because that's how my brain works. I mean, it's a couple of thoughts. Do we actually need the word followership? Because again, it was interesting listening to your description of the Prussian army approach to the terminology. Firstly, intelligent disobedience. I like that concept personally, but you talked about the desire for many to be active in leading. That was those were the words you used, Bill, that you defined followership as leadership. And, I think the military context probably invented the term followership because leadership at that point in time was a title. There was a leader formally, and therefore others were de facto followers. But we live in a corporate environment and hopefully a social environment today where leadership is not a title. Leadership is a human obligation. We are all leaders. And if we are all leaders, do we need to talk about followership?
Yeah. The followership, I think, actually came in from business. It used to be called mission command as opposed to command and control. So command and control was, here's a plan, here's your role in it, you do what I've told you to do, and you don't come back until you've done it. And that was command and control. Mission command is saying, here's the objective, you're the expert on how you get there, and do you agree with this plan and will it work? And looks for feedback. And there is this matrix that was developed, and I think the matrix was developed by business rather than the military. And the trouble with matrix is on a podcast that doesn't have video, it's quite hard to describe. But the vertical matrix, the vertical axis is critical thinking. The top end of the axis is independent critical thinking. They think independently. The lower end of the arrow is dependent critical thinking. So they can only think dependent upon what their manager tells them. And then you have active and passive, or the horizontal axis. And the top right is effective followers they are independent critical thinkers, and they are active, and they're effective followers. And the top left axis, the top left square, is independent critical thinking, but passive. And they tend to be alienated, counterproductive, and objectionable. The bottom right is yes people. They're active, but they're dependent and fairly uncritical. So they're yes people. And the bottom left, who are dependent, uncritical, and passive, are sheep. And so it's saying this is how we look at the organization, and we will promote to the officer class, or the equivalent in business, those who are critical and independent and active. So that's where the terms come from, and that's what followership has come to mean. But Thierry is shaking his head.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that organizations want to promote people who are effective followers in the sense that they have independent critical thinking and they are active, I have to say I've seen a number of cases where it's more yes people that don't cause trouble that get through the ranks because they don't cause trouble. Independent thinkers are not welcome in all companies by far. And then it's not a debate here of pointing fingers, but I think that depending on the industry, obviously depending on the role. However, it's highly dependent on the context, the company, the values of the company, how it's run, and the history of it as well.
To build on that, what Thierry was just said, I think, as you know, I'm working in the game theory field. It's a matter of wrong incentives in many organizations that the yes people have actually an advantage, because for them individually, there is an incentive not to cause too much noise, even if for the overall organization, it would be better if people would speak up. I think we all have heard the famous saying, first-class people hire first-class people, second-class people hire third-class people. And if you ask people, do you agree to that? I'm pretty sure that 99.9% of people would agree to it. But in reality, at least outside of consulting where I'm active in, let's face it, in an organization where people that you are hiring into your team that potentially could replace yourself are causing a threat to you individually. So while for the organization, it would be good to have first-class people underneath yourself, for you personally, there is a risk in doing that.
Bigger risk is having people that you have to micromanage and monitor and know what they're doing, almost be able to do their job to make sure they're doing it properly. Is it not a much lesser risk if you've got people that you can simply say, here's what needs to be done, do you agree? I'd like your input. Right, let's go and do it. That has to be the easier way of doing it.
Yes, but it's more dangerous, I think, as Armin said.
Personally dangerous, or for the company dangerous to whom?
For the individual. And that's my point. The incentive for the individual is unfortunately not necessarily aligned with the incentive for the organization. For you as an individual, it might be better to have people working for you who are simply doing as you tell them what they should do, as long as they are not doing things really wrong and they are less of a threat for yourself than if you have people who are so good that someone else might see them as a potential substitute for yourself.
I'm really worried that you're right, Armin, and that the world really has moved backwards in 2 or 3 decades. But Bob, what do you think?
Now, just a few comments, Bill, going back to, and picking up on what Thierry and Armin were saying, there are kind of different discourses which are slightly idealized in leadership training. The trait-based approach is from the 1940s, actually describing what idealized leaders do. What you just described there, Bill, is very much a 1940s approach. It's describing the attributes of a follower. And as with leaderships, when you actually look at who are successful leaders, there isn't a common set of attributes. That successful leaders don't follow the idealized norms set by kind of practitioner books. So we're immediately in a slightly ambiguous context that the expectations of followership behavior may not correlate to followership success in a strange kind of way. The other thing that strikes me in listening to the discussion is that the leader-follower paradigm is very much based upon a team leadership concept. Well, we've all been discussing, I think, implicitly direct reports, followers of leaders in the team context. And I think the modern organization today, actually, its success is not dependent on the unit of team. I think that's a 1970s, maybe even 1960s position. I think now we are in the world of high performing networks, almost amorphous linkages cross-functionally across multiple borders. And I'm not very clear where follower fits into that. I mean, who am I following in a complex network? It's no longer my direct leader. And therefore, I think the weakness of followership is it doesn't play into the complex networks that individuals have to find themselves within and position themselves within. Or maybe it does. Maybe the term can adapt to that.
I like that thought, Bob. And I think why I said very in the beginning, a little bit different, that's proactivism is not necessarily something that has to be an element of it. You're right, in that network concept, proactivism is the key, is the currency that is in place to show whether you have a network that is really helping you to accomplish your goals. In a network, it's less about just telling people what they should do, but it's to inspire people to do things that bring you forward without having this direct line of management in place. I like that, I thought.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say that I think it's one of the key distinctive attributes of people in procurement. We always work in networks or within networks, and this, creating a followership and also making sure that the way we enact followership is always cross-functional and even cross boundaries from, our own organization with suppliers, even tier 2, tier 3 sometimes. And I think this is a key distinctive element. I want to just do a very quick backtrack, regarding what Armin was saying, that people are afraid of having a team of 2 brilliant individuals. Let's say they get pushed away themselves. I want to say I have a friend who has a very different approach, who is, I need to make sure that people from my team can replace me so that I can move forward. And so he has always been pushing maybe not all, but at least several individuals to make sure he could get promoted somewhere else.
I'd like to push back a little bit on the idea that only procurement manages across networks, because I don't know of any roles that don't. I mean, every position I've ever been in has always involved taking leadership from people outside the area I'm working in and creating a team of other people who are not direct reports. And that to me, is the nature of a modern organization. And that has followership written all through it, because in my role, I was following the organization and trying to translate that message into targets, and it cascaded. So everybody in the organization was both a leader and a follower. And if that dates back to the 1940s or the 50s, I'm afraid that's dated me. Bob, you were going to say something.
No, I'm just the fact that you were saying, Bill, that kind of network-based leadership is everywhere. It struck me as we were talking, maybe we're on the cusp or on the moment of creating a new vocabulary, because ultimately maybe what we're talking about is networkship.
Networkship. It's an uncomfortable word, but I quite like the concept of it.
Because followership has a kind of a dualism, follower and leader. Networkship has a multi-dimensionality, which I think captures the underlying essence of what we're speaking about, and trying to force the term followership into that. So I just throw it out there. Does networkship liberate us to think in slightly newer ways and different ways, the ways, in fact, we're trying to articulate?
I think it's a good thing to pick up because, and here I take responsibility, the term followership was used to be deliberately provocative because everybody talked about leadership. So when we wanted to talk, people generally in business wanted to say, it's not just about leadership, the term followership, just to be provocative, was brought up in order that people would say, oh, I don't want to be a follower. Yes, you do, would be the answer. And here's why. So your point, Bob, about maybe we need a different word to describe this position where everybody is a leader, everybody is a follower, and they're doing it at the same time.
While we are discussing, I was looking up the field manual from the US Army, how it defines leadership. And one word in particular, I think, is worth a discussion, because there it is defined as the process of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. And I would like to emphasize a little bit on the word process, because what is it what we can do in order to either become good leaders or to make people good followers or good networkers, however we want to define them. What is it what we can do instead of just describing what it is?
And?
I have a thought on that, but I wanted to give first the podium to others.
Well, just to step in, I mean, the networkship would be, for example, the process of building networks within organizations such that complex ecosystems could transmit information and take decisions in an agile way and in a customer-centric way. It's just to throw a definition out there. But I really like the process approach as opposed to the trait-based approach.
Doesn't network and process, don't they both imply a smooth, unchanging path through a system? Whereas what I think followership is about critical thinking and making sure that the message, the strategy is actually changed by implementation. That when new information comes along, you have the people who are willing to and capable of analyzing it, finding out what it means, how it affects the plans, changing those plans and moving forward collectively, whether or not they are the leader or the follower. It's more than just a network, surely. Thierry.
Yeah, I just want to say, Bill, by definition, a network has multiple paths. Otherwise, it's a chain. And I think that it answers your question about being, unidirectional monopath concept. When a network, you will have multiple ways to arrive to a result, which is as close to what you expect it to be.
In the network that you're imagining, it's pretty linear because the message doesn't change. More like the internet. So if I send a message, it can go by 193 different routes. But when it reaches the other end, it's the same set of zeros and ones. It is exactly the same digit.
Because you don't expect critical thinking from internet, Bill. Sorry to interrupt.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That is a linear network. A complex network would change the information as it goes through because the world has changed. Because as those, talk about graph theory, if you like, talking about networks, but as that information as the situation develops, the information should change. And active followership is able to respond to that change. That's what I'm getting at. So I'm introducing systems theory basically to counter, because that's my hobby horse, and Armin might come back at me with game theory. But
I think we need to add an additional attribute here, because I would call them impactful or purposeful networks, as otherwise a network could be just coffee conversations that are leading nowhere and are not helping you to accomplish anything. So building a network to accomplish a certain impact is definitely a form of art, and is what I think we're all talking here about. Now, in order to make that happen, game theory tells us very simply that you need to give people an incentive. An incentive doesn't have to be a monetary incentive. It can be just a shared vision, a shared purpose, how Thierry mentioned it earlier. But what definitely is important and the key element is trust that what you are asking people to do, or when people are doing something that helps you, is that there is, in any form, monetary or non-monetary, something that is helping them as well, a certain tit for tat element in it, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting, thinking while we talk is, it reminds me of an article by Sanjay Gulati. It's about 15 years old, and he was talking of meta organizations, especially taking examples from the open source developed software, where you have a bunch of people without any structured or completely structured organization that have a shared vision, and they, for me, in our discussion, they would embody followership, being guided by the same overall purpose, and recognizing, contributions that are more valuable or valuable enough to be incorporated into products. And there is now on the market an ERP system that has been developed as an open source product, so you can really arrive to complex things.
But even if you have these non-monetary motivation factors that you described in the open source world, if there would be a person who is bringing up 25, 30, 50 suggestions and doesn't ever get any kind of feedback from the rest of the community, he or she will probably stop contributing further. So even when it's non-monetary, there has to be some kind of appreciation for your contribution.
And do you have something to propose, or?
No, I think that's necessary for becoming a good leader, that you are acknowledging when people are doing something that is helping you, and either monetary or non-monetary, that you're not just taking things for granted, and building that kind of trust that people are knowing that when they do something, it will be seen, it will be honored in one way or the other. That is what is motivating people to become good followers.
Yeah, so isn't there a traditional sense that if I know that someone is listening to my suggestions, taking them seriously, letting me down gently if they don't work, or if they think the majority think they're wrong, that as a result I feel part of whatever decision is reached by the team, and that if that has been well thought through and everybody supports it, and I'm part of that implementation, that to me is one hell of a reward. And it would take an awful lot of money to pay for that sense of satisfaction. And that's where I think I'm coming from on a definition of followership. We're still talking definitions of followership. I'm sorry. We've actually moved on to organization and culture and the sort of people you want. So apologies.
I'm just introduced another angle on followership that was inspired by the conversation. When you say in English, I follow you,
yes.
what I'm saying in that context is I listen to you, I understand you, I respect you, I appreciate you. And that's something that should never, ever be underestimated in terms of human interaction. And if I don't think that the classical definition of followership carries that, but that's quite that for me is an inspirational, rather fundamental aspect of human interaction. Try to say I follow you a little bit more often. Commit to that position.
I'd go further. I love it. I do think inspirational is not an understatement, because when someone says, I follow you, they're not just following. They're not just walking 2 meters behind. They're with you. They're walking alongside you.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what, to me, is what is meant by I follow you.
Mm.
That's powerful. I knew it was good to have a linguist here. Wonderful. We've actually used quite a lot of time. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure we've got anywhere. We've probably gone round in lots and lots of extraordinarily enjoyable circles. But I'm going to ask all of you to, if you have any final thoughts. You don't have to have, but I'll start with Thierry and ask if you have any thoughts about the discussion and where it's got to and if it's been useful for you.
I have more questions now, and that's great. I've got I took a lot of notes, a lot of things to think about. And I have to say, it as a small pun, one of my favorite concepts is fellowship rather than followership, and it comes from a certain series of books. You can imagine that. But I think that it's also a very powerful way of approaching things, in the sense that the idea of when you can go into creating a fellowship, you have abolished the idea of leaders and followers. And you really are purely on the commitment to a purpose. And this, I think, allows individuals and organizations to go way further. However, it's rare. But we can probably come back on the followership topic 1 year from now, and we will have different ideas.
Once more, I truly enjoyed the discussion, as it's made me think about something that way too often you take for granted. And like we started discussion, you come up with a definition, but once you really start digging a little bit deeper and you see the different nuances and facets and then think about what does it actually really mean. And I loved the comment from you, Bob, with I follow you, I listen to you, what you're doing is, I think, a very remarkable thought. What it tells me in an organizational context is that the traditional answer in most organizations that marketing comes up or the strategy department comes up with a vision and a mission statement, which is then communicated and everyone is hoping that the entire organization is following. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's a tiny first step. But that leadership is really listening and trying to see what the others are bringing to the table is a crucial element to generate that trust and purpose and sharing commitment to get things progressing in the way you want them.
Yeah, further evidence of the power of dialogue. Very, very interesting. Thank you. This idea of talking through and interrogating definitions, I think that is a kind of practice that is under-practiced in business today. Actually, as you were saying, Thierry, almost escaping definitions. It's the Wittgenstein that language is a prisoner for the human being. And actually, Armin, you mentioned process as trusting the process of dialogue to lead us to a creative insight. And although I started with a very strong, almost emotional opposition to followership, I end up with quite a strong identification with the word follow. So I'm much more confused than I was at the beginning, but I think that's quite a healthy thing.
Well, I follow you. I think a lot about that because it doesn't imply I believe everything you say. It doesn't imply that I'm going to do exactly what you say. It means I'm with you. I understand where you're coming from, and I'm here. And I'll share I'll build on that. It's wonderful. And I do think this dialogue thing's important, and it's why Swishoes exists. That's what Swishoes is. Anyway, that's it for episode 5 of Swishoes on an unfortunately chosen word, followership, but maybe it's achieved its end. And with that, I'll say cheerio from Thierry Fausten, from Armin Scharlach, from Bob Dignen, and from myself, Bill Young, until episode 6. And we don't know what that'll be about. Thank you.